Hi guys, my name is Siobhan Fallon, and today we're going to discuss Fred and Kate Benteen again. If you've missed any of the earlier segments about their lives, please take a look. So let's cover the Yellowstone Campaign, the Fort Laramie Treaties 1 and 2, and the Black Hills Expedition, and how that paved the way for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We last left off at Fort Hays, Kansas in 1871. So let's pick up there. Now, these two blue photos you're looking at are of a younger Fred and Kate Benteen. I've never seen these photos anywhere except on the sort of rare book jacket of John Carroll's Camp Talk, the very private letters of Frederick Benteen to his wife. Carroll doesn't give any information about them. There's no date, no location. He only mentions they were shared by the Steves family, who are descendants of the Benteens. I wanted to include them here, well, one, because I totally forgot about them in my earlier presentations, but also because I think they show a different Benteen and Kate that we're used to seeing. There's a hint of wealth here that you don't see in the later frontier photos of them. We know that both of their families had hit tough times, which caused teenage Benteen to leave Virginia and teenage Kate to leave Philadelphia. And that's why they both ended up in St. Louis, where they met. Both their fathers were tradesmen. Benteen's dad was a paint contractor and a sign maker, and Kate's was a mechanic who was working at a patent, or on a patent, for a pottery kiln just before his death. I mean, look at Benteen's top hat and Kate's dress, gloves, and fan. I see these photos and I'm reminded of how difficult a frontier life was compared to the life Kate and Benteen may have had if, after the Civil War, Benteen had not been robbed at gunpoint when he was building his new farm in Atlanta and he was shot and all of his horses were stolen. That was what prompted him to join the Army, and he bid farewell to this very different life. In today's discussion, we're going to see how grueling life at frontier posts could be, especially for Kate, while Benteen was away on one of his many cavalry campaigns. Okay, now back 1871. Benteen is at Fort Hays alone. Kate is visiting Georgia with their young son Freddie, and she is taking much too long to return to her husband. Benteen has found out that the 7th is about to deploy to various posts in the South to protect officials against rising white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and also to serve as a general deterrent to unlawful behavior. Benteen, who always identified as a Virginian, would later write, "While on duty in the South, we were required to accompany deputy U.S. Marshals as a mounted police force, and it is the most unsatisfactory work that a cavalryman can be detailed for. We preferred blizzards, snow and all, to mounted police duty." I'm also going to read an excerpt from a letter Benteen wrote to Kate on March 12, 1871. This letter is the earliest one to Kate in the letter collection at the University of Georgia. "My dear Frab, your slightly sarcastic epistle of last Sunday night came to hand yesterday. I can't do the subject justice without saying things that had better not be said. Therefore, I shall let the matter rest. If you liked the place down there so very well, and had told me so long ago, I doubtless could have enjoyed myself very much better than I have done. I am in no humor for writing after reading such letters from you. I telegraphed you last Tuesday, which explains what little I know about our last news of going to Kentucky. A soldier's life is too short for such slow movements. I have sold the black cow and calf for $85. If you don't hurry and come back, I will sell or give away everything around the premises. Life since you have left has been a blank. Would it had, and I had slept through it, and I would blow my damn brains out before I would live another 4 months like it. So for Christ's sake, come home quickly. Remember me to the family. I shall not write any more to you. Kiss Fred for me, and fill him up with bananas. I shall look for you on the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th of this month, and to look forward to that time seems an age. Your devoted husband, F. W. Benteen. Well, Kate did make it back, hopefully before Benteen gave all her things away. In May 1871, Benteen and Kate and little Freddie boarded a train for Kentucky on their way to Nashville. While stopping in Louisville, they were visited by George Custer, Tom Custer, and William Weiner Cook. Custer wanted Benteen and his H Company to swap his assignment with his brother Tom and M Company, giving Tom Nashville and Benteen South Carolina. But Benteen, being Benteen, was suspicious and said he would take it up with Colonel Sturgis, the commander of the 7th Cavalry. Custer made a comment to Kate, saying, "Anything he recommended to me, I was pretty sure to choose the exact opposite." And Kate agreed with Custer, telling Benteen he was, quote, "dead wrong." Benteen said his wife was, quote, "not the poker player I was, and she didn't know the scoundrel as I did." Well, Benteen did not accept the South Carolina switch, and he and his family were garrisoned in Nashville. Benteen and his H Company would remain in the South, bouncing around from Nashville, Tennessee, to Alabama, to Nashville again, from May 1871 to April 1873. Happily for Benteen, he managed to once again change out his company mounts for new horses, this time fine Southern thoroughbreds. Recruits also poured in. One was German immigrant Charles Windolf, who spoke of first meeting Benteen. "I thought he was the finest looking soldier I had ever seen. He had bright eyes and a ruddy face and a great thatch of iron gray hair. It made him look mighty handsome." Also new to H Company was Joseph McCurry, a 23-year-old baseball player from Pennsylvania, who became one of the youngest first sergeants in the Army at the time, perhaps promoted by his gifts at baseball. In March 1st, 1873, the Benteen Baseball Club officially started up in Nashville.
It's a home run!
On April 2nd, 1872, Kate had a baby girl, Fanny Gibson Benteen, probably named for Major George Gibson of the 5th Infantry. And you can check out my Annie Yates video for a little bit more about Major Gibson. In April 1873, the entire 7th Cavalry was transferred to the Dakota Territories to prepare for a summer expedition. Benteen said this posting, after the time spent in the South, was hailed with delight. Benteen wrote to Kate on May 20th, 1873, "I hope the baby has gotten into a doubtless fair way of recovery, not having so much faith that she has recovered as yet. Time sufficient, in my opinion, not having elapsed. Kiss Fred and Fan for me." 2 companies, Companies D and I, under Major Reno, were sent north to escort a party of international boundary surveyors. But the remaining 10 companies of 7th Cavalry assembled at Fort Rice in June 1873. History books refer to this as the Yellowstone Campaign or the Stanley Expedition. It was under the command of Colonel David S. Stanley of the 22nd Infantry, and the 19 infantry companies joined the 10 companies of the 7th Cavalry under Custer. So much for the adage, distance makes the heart grow fonder. As soon as they were reunited, Custer and Benteen immediately clashed, again over horses. A lieutenant with Stanley was riding a mule, and he asked Benteen's help in procuring a horse. Benteen revealed to this man that Custer had appropriated a horse for Lieutenant James Calhoun's young brother and a civilian, Fred Calhoun, who had joined the expedition. Supposedly, a complaint was filed with Stanley about this horse, and Custer was put under arrest. But then Colonel Stanley got, quote, stupidly drunk, and proper charges against Custer were never filed. That's what Benteen would write years later. Perhaps it's no wonder that Benteen's H Company was tasked with C Company to remain and not continue campaigning with the rest of the 7th Cavalry, wrote Sergeant Charles Windolph. H Troop and a company of the 17th Infantry had been left behind on the lower reaches of the Yellowstone to guard supplies at a temporary fort we called Stanley's Stockade. Benteen would therefore not be a part of Custer's fights with the Sioux on August 4th and August 11th. Benteen did not seem to mind. He considered himself all kinds of fisherman as well as all kinds of hunter, and his mess was well cared for. The table fairly groaned with fried channel catfish, elk, black-tailed deer, and a few big horns. Baby Fan dies on July 8, 1873 at Fort Rice. We know she'd been sick in May when Fred had written to Kate and asked if she had recovered. I understand this was a more stoic age than our own today, and the infant and child mortality rate from the mid to late 1800s was incredibly high. 26.9% of newborns died in their first year of life, and 46.2% of children died before they reached adulthood. But I think it's really strange that Benteen, in all the existent letters, never mentions Baby Fan again. He doesn't mention any of the babies that Kate buried while he was away, or even seem to check to see if Kate was handling these deaths well. So, as a mother, I think it's more likely that Kate destroyed any of the letters he had mentioned the babies in, and that they had just been too painful for her to keep. She did keep a letter from July 30th, 1873, when Benteen wrote to Kate and asks her to get any or all the papers containing any accounts of the expedition, as they are sometimes excellent for reference. He also wrote in this letter, "A soldier's life is filled with sacrifices and mortifications. There are thousands of poor laborers eking out scanty livings, who enjoy life hugely in comparison to what many officers of the army do, particularly those of the cavalry service. They can be at home with their families and know when their day's work is done, that a cavalry man can but a short time be, and the latter he scarcely ever knows." Enclosed in the same letter is a poem called "The Wife" that Benteen had found in a Yankton newspaper. "And always she was there to cast on everything a splendor, to fold him with that constant love so strong, because so tender, to grow with every passing year more beautiful before him, to sweetly be adored, and still more sweetly to adore him." So, although Benteen doesn't overtly mention Baby Fan in this letter, written just a couple of weeks after the baby's death, I think his words are deliberately comforting, and he's making clear how much he loves his wife and family, and he wishes he was home with them. Benteen would go on in that letter. "Our 3 great pollens, enveloping our tents without touching them, spread a large shade all around us, and the cool soft breeze wafting through is indeed delicious. Very little else, with your presence and Fred's, is needed to make life at this point perfectly charming. I only wish you could have been here. Oceans of love and kisses to Fred, and love and sweet things illimitable to my darling wife from her lonely and devoted husband." When they set off for Fort Rice, Benteen and his company, whether it was that I had experienced such a paradisiacal time in the Yellowstone while the other poor fellows were battling with the Dakotas and hoofing it through cactus-covered red-hot plains, were detailed to escort a party of surveyors under Thomas Rosser, who some of you might know as a friend of Custer's from West Point, as well as a Confederate general, and he would later write critical letters about Major Reno to the newspapers. I mention Rosser quite a bit in other presentations too. Benteen accompanied Thomas Rosser through the Badlands in what Benteen described as a real pleasure, as I knew the route and the bighorns I could get there were oh so fat. In late September 1873, Benteen would return to Fort Rice. He would learn that his H Company, as well as Companies C, K, and M, were to be posted at Fort Rice, while 6 other companies of the Seventh Cavalry, including George Armstrong Custer, would be assigned 25 miles away at the regimental headquarters at Fort Abraham Lincoln, and 2 other companies were sent to Fort Totten. Let's do a little bit of backstory here. These are 2 maps that represent the first Fort Laramie Treaty signed in 1851 between the United States government and representatives of the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. One of the maps color codes the different tribal lands. The other shows how the treaty falls across U.S. state lines. This original treaty attempted to guarantee safe passage for settlers on the Oregon Trail and allow forts and roads to be built in exchange for annuities or supplies given to the tribes. It also sought to make a, quote, effective and lasting peace among the 8 tribes, many of whom were tribal enemies and had fought and displaced each other for generations. The treaty was a failure. Now, there was a lot of white violence against Native Americans and vice versa, but there was also a great deal of intertribal warfare. For example, the Crow warrior Wolfbow urged the army to, quote, put the Sioux Indians in their own country and keep them from troubling us. And Chief Whiteshield in 1864 said, we, the Arikara, have been driven from our country on the other side of the Missouri River by the Sioux. Meanwhile, there were rumors of gold in the Black Hills. In 1867, General Sherman, who was commanding the military division of the Missouri, wrote to General Alfred Terry, commanding the Department of the Dakotas, quote, you may forbid all white people going there at present and warn all that the United States will not protect them. In 1868, the second Laramie Treaty between the Plains tribes was signed in hopes that it would end 25 years of raids and retaliations and land disputes. The U.S. government, Forts Phil Kearny, Smith, and Reno were evacuated. The Lakota were given a reservation consisting of that part in the Dakota Territory lying west of the Missouri. Annuities were provided for a few years, as well as education for Native American children and agricultural instruction for the men. The Lakota promised not to molest builders of the Union Pacific who were laying tracks across the plains. They also were not to attack wagon trains, nor were they to scalp or kill white men or capture or kill their women and children. They also promised not to attack the homelands of the Crow, the Shoshone, the Arikara, or the Pawnee. For those of you who wonder why there were so many Shoshone, Arikara, and Crow scouts working with the United States Army in 1876, fighting at the Lakota and the Cheyenne with General Crook at the Rosebud, as well as fighting with Lieutenant Colonel Custer against the Lakota and Cheyenne at Little Bighorn. This is why. Now, Lakota chiefs Red Cloud and Spotted Tail did try to keep the peace. But in 1873 and 1874, instances of Lakota violence against white settlers, as well as attacks against other tribes who continue to ask the U.S. government for intervention, was on the rise. One example of this is the Battle of Massacre Canyon, which took place in Nebraska in 1873 in August, when a large group of Lakota warriors attacked a band of Pawnee during their summer buffalo hunt. The Lakota killed more than 150 Pawnee, mostly women and children, mutilating and setting some of the bodies on fire. These events created an official reason for the Army to survey the Black Hills region. General Sheridan claimed he wanted a new fort within the reservation area in order to stop the tribes from raiding settlements to the south. Of course, the Lakota strongly disagreed, and they would refer to this coming expedition as the Thieves' Road. In the summer of 1874, General Sheridan would send Lieutenant Colonel George Custer into the Black Hills. Custer was given a little over a month to prepare for this expedition. He'd requested 150 new men to fill out his companies, but was denied. He was allowed 2 infantry companies to serve as guards on the condition that Custer could manage the infantry without any added expense. Custer had to go through military protocol and worry about money just like everybody else, and like others, his hands were tied. Something else that's often overlooked is that this was considered a very dangerous mission. The 7th Cavalry expected a fight, and the Lakota were a formidable foe. That's the book cover of an excellent account of the expedition by a soldier in Benteen's H Company, Private Theodore Ewart, who was also a big baseball fan. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were worried about the campaign, and their families must have been too, knowing their husbands were about to march off to an uncertain future. This is an ongoing and universal feature of military life. Ewart wrote, "We all believed that scarce half our number would return," and he also says that one of the, quote, topics of discussion that kept us up till late at night was how many would return. He gives a poignant description of Army wives, quote, "A soldier and his wife are liable to be parted at any minute and for any length of time. Whenever duty calls, the soldier must obey and go, and the poor wife, sick or well, ill or dying, sees him go with how heavy a heart God and herself alone know. She cries as if her heart would break, for he goes on the trail of a marauding tribe of Indians. She is sure he will have to fight ere the return, and now as he is hastily preparing, she is looking upon him perhaps for the last time upon this earth. In her love for him, she imagines all sorts of mishaps. Such, dear readers, is a soldier's parting on the frontiers." In late May 1874, Sheridan learned that a Lakota war party was planning on attacking the Arikara and Mandan, and he wired Custer to intercept them, saying, quote, "The Ree and Mandan ought to be protected the same as white settlers." Custer sent over 100 mounted soldiers from Fort Rice to try to intercept these warriors, wiring his own superiors that, quote, "I deem it of far more importance that a check should be given this war party than the expedition should start promptly." The 7th soldiers scouted for more than 40 miles and found nothing, and then returned to Fort Rice. They therefore missed the 400 Lakota who ambushed a party of Arikara and Mandan, killing 5. On July 2nd, 1874, the Black Hills expedition began. Custer left Fort Lincoln with 10 cavalry companies, 2 infantry companies, artillery with 3 Gatling guns and 1 3-inch cannon, an engineering detachment, more than 70 Native American scouts, including a handful of Sioux, and also Custer's most trusted Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, and guides such as Charlie Reynolds, teamsters, a scientific corps that included miners, geologists, and naturalists, the photographer, William Illingsworth, newspaper correspondents, and, leave it to Custer, a 16-piece band. Supplies were carried in 110 wagons. 300 head of cattle were taken along. Also, the president's son, Lieutenant Colonel Fred D. Grant, joined the expedition. Whew. As we mentioned, the 7th feared hostilities between them and the Lakota, but all their interactions with the Lakota would end up being peaceful. Deliberately so. On July 26, Custer captured a small village of Sioux, giving strict orders that they should not be harmed. He sent forward a white flag by one of his interpreters and followed it almost instantly himself. Benteen and his company did manage in quite a few games of, you guessed it, baseball. After one of these, he celebrated with a champagne dinner. That's Benteen, and that's President Grant's son, Fred Grant. They had to bury 2 soldiers from H Company on this expedition, and Private Ewart would put the blame for their deaths squarely on the shoulders of the doctors he referred to as Butcher Allen and Drunken Williams. Benteen read the funeral services for soldier James King as the 7th began their march. Ewart would describe it as this, quote, "In the gray twilight of the morning, the men with bowed heads, tears trickling down their sunburnt cheeks, the dead body suspended over the grave, the captain with his gray hair reading the service, the silence, all are impressed on my memory, never to be erased." The expedition did end up finding gold. When the frontier press learned of it, they greatly exaggerated the claims. Remember, the country was still recovering from a depression known as the Panic of 1873, and unemployment and poverty were at a new high. So politicians and the press were very happy to have a diversion. A gold rush ensued, with prospectors illegally entering the Black Hills. The Lakota were rightly outraged by this trespassing. All of this will play a role in the confrontation at the Little Bighorn in 1876. Benteen would later write, "My conscience was never wholly at ease while engaged in warring with them and routing them from their paradise. I saw with gladness how little was required to make a people supremely happy, but by some miscalculation our government never lost the gentle art of making enemies of them." For now, the 7th Cavalry returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln on August 30th, 1874. In sarcastic lines that could have been written by Benteen himself, Ewart describes the return, quote, "As we rode past the officers' quarters, each would drop out, embrace and kiss his wife, and retire mid welcomes, caresses, etc. Mrs. General Custer came to meet her husband, but just as she came in, catching distance, she fainted. A very pretty piece of byplay for the men of the command." The companies who were stationed at Fort Rice headed there the next day. Here are some of the Fort Rice officers and their families on the steps of Major Tilford's home, probably taken in August or September of 1874. Remember, Custer, with many of his friends and immediate family, were at Fort Abraham Lincoln, which is about 25 miles away. But there's quite a community at Fort Rice as well. The Tilfords, Merrills, DeRudios, and others also had plenty of children. That's a close-up of Benteen, Kate, and little Freddie. Kate is likely pregnant in this photo. Within weeks of returning from the Black Hills, the company stationed at Fort Rice had a new assignment, Louisiana. K Company went to Shreveport, but Benteen's H Company went to New Orleans. They deployed there because of more political unrest and clashes dealing with Reconstruction, and troops were needed to protect the unpopular state officials. Though Benteen seems to have had himself a fine time, and Kate and Freddie joined him there. He'll later write, "I had a drag, or carriage, in New Orleans at the time, and to pull it 2 grand Mabrino mares, as nimble as deer. I used to frequently take Sheridan out to the racetrack in it. I had at the time 2 thoroughbreds at the track entered for spring races. The drive was a beautiful one, and the springtime grand." Kate gave birth to her 5th child in April 1875. Theodore Norman Benteen. In May 1875, H Company was reassigned to the Dakota Territories. They arrived at Fort Randall to prepare for another summer campaign to the Black Hills, this time to evict miners who were trespassing. It was a great opportunity for Benteen Baseball Club to play some ball. In July, Benteen commanded a battalion consisting of H Company, McDougall's E Company, and Moylan's A Company. The number of illegal prospectors had risen from 800 of the summer before to over 15,000, wrote Sergeant Charles Windolph of H Company. "White miners trooped into the hills despite every effort made by the army to keep them out. Benteen's H Company was dispatched with the unhappy task of herding the miners from new diggings." In the process of rounding up the trespassers, Benteen met Brigadier General George Crook, who was the commanding officer of the Department of the Platte, with the jurisdiction south and west of the Black Hills. Crook asked Benteen what he was doing in the Black Hills. Now, Benteen was there under orders of General Alfred Terry, who was the general actually responsible for the Lakota Reservation, and Benteen did not appreciate Crook's manner of questioning. Benteen replied that he did not have enough rank to issue his own orders. We shall see Crook and Benteen clash more in the future. Again from Sergeant Windolph, "An attempt was made that summer of '75 to buy the Black Hills from the Indians and to make legal this onslaught. But the Indians were in no mood to believe anything the commissioners told them. Maybe the radical things Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were preaching made sense. The free Indian was doomed. They were all to be made reservation Indians. Maybe those radical chiefs were right. Maybe they'd be better make one big battle against the whites. It would be better to die a free Indian than live as a helpless treaty Indian." And Custer himself wrote, "The success of the reservation system depends on the government keeping its promises. The Indians have a strong attachment for the lands containing the bones of their ancestors and dislike leaving it. Love of country is almost a religion to them. It is not the value of the land they consider. but their strong local attachment they feel that white men do not feel and consequently do not respect. The Indian keenly feels the injustice that has been done to him, and being a proud and haughty nature, he resents it. Benteen may not have been able to remove all the illegal prospectors, but he did manage to beat them at baseball. He played a team of, quote, citizen teamsters, and his Benteen Baseball Club handily defeated them 25-11. Benteen and his battalion escorted a group of miners out of the Black Hills and returned to Fort Rice on September 20th, 1875. He was made the acting post commander at Fort Rice as Major Tilford was on leave of absence. Tragedy would strike in December of 1875. From the memoir of Katie Gibson, wife of Lieutenant Francis Gibson, this excerpt. Colonel Benteen and my husband were ordered downriver to investigate some Indian trouble. While they were away, Benteen's youngest child died. And I was with the poor mother every moment I could spare. No coffins were obtainable, not even a carpenter, so a soldier just put together a plain pine box, the best he could do. But oh, how forlorn! Mrs. Benteen asked if it would be possible to line it, so as to take away some of the crudeness. But there was no material to be had for love or money. This must be finished tonight, so do try to bring it to me, no matter how late, she said. I hurried hopefully to the trader's store, but found nothing among the shop-worn goods. I looked upon my own belongings in vain, and then I had an idea. My wedding dress. It was lovely, and my choicest treasure, but it had to be sacrificed. Armed with a big bundle of cotton batting from the hospital and a box of tacks, I started. The swan's down was to be used for a pillow upon which to rest the baby's head. With the help of Lieutenant Matthey, we finished the casket, and it was my belief that angels could have done no more. It was almost dawn when Lieutenant Matthey escorted me to Colonel Benteen's headquarters. At the funeral, there was neither service nor clergyman. We walked to the little cemetery on the hill, knelt beside the small grave, and commended the baby soul to the Father whence it came. Now, we already mentioned the high infant mortality rate of the 1800s. The Benteens lost 4 out of 5 children, and all evidence points to Benteen being away during the death of each child. Baby Caroline died in March of 1865 in St. Louis while Benteen was on campaign during the Civil War with the 10th Missouri. Baby Catherine died in December 1868 while he was in the field after the Washita fight. And baby Fanny died in July 1873 while he was on the Yellowstone expedition. And now poor baby Theodore in 1875. Man, that is so much for a marriage to handle. I can't even imagine. Young Freddie, from then onward, must have meant the world to them. Meanwhile, there were other tragic events happening on a larger scale. We spoke about the miners flooding the Black Hills looking for gold, and the inability of the Army to keep them out. In December 1875, President Grant met with the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Interior, and Generals Sherman and Sheridan. Grant decided to turn a blind eye on the illegal mining settlements. On December 6, 1875, the Bureau of Indian Affairs announced that the Sioux were out of control, and they issued an ultimatum that the tribes roaming in the unceded territories had to report to their reservations by January 31st, 1876, or they would be rounded up by the Army. Thus the wheels started turning on what would be called the Great Sioux War, or the Centennial Campaign of 1876. General Sheridan created the strategy with 3 columns. One, under Colonel John Gibbon, was to block Lakota flight north along the Yellowstone River. The second, under General Crook, was to block retreat from the south. And the third column, under General Terry, with Lieutenant Colonel George Custer leading the 7th Cavalry, would move west along the Yellowstone until the hostile camps had been located, and then strike. On May 5, 1876, Benteen, at the head of companies H and M, departed Fort Rice for Fort Abraham Lincoln. They arrived the next day and set up camp about 2 miles outside of Fort Lincoln. This would be the first time all 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry campaigned together. Now, the 7th Cav was authorized 42 officers. However, they were woefully short-staffed in this regard, and they would march with only 28, and they had to borrow a 29th from the 20th Infantry, 2nd Lieutenant John Crittenden. Custer had been absent from Fort Lincoln for a couple of months, testifying in Congress, and his testimony indirectly implied corruption in the Grant administration. President Grant was not happy, and he almost removed Custer from the campaign. So Custer returned to Fort Lincoln just a few days before the 7th departed. Upon his return, Custer organized the regiment into 2 wings. The right wing was led by Major Marcus Reno. And Marcus Reno was the only 7th Cavalry major on this campaign. His wing consisted of B Company, Captain McDougall, C Company, Captain Tom Custer, E Company, Lieutenant Algernon Smith, F Company, Captain George Yates, I Company, Captain Miles Keogh, and L Company, First Lieutenant James Calhoun. The left wing was led by Captain Benteen, who was the senior captain of the 7th, and this consisted of A Company, Captain Moylan, D Company, Captain Thomas Weir, G Company, First Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, H Company, which is of course Benteen himself, K Company, First Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, and M Company, Captain French. Custer invited Benteen to his tent. Benteen found Mrs. Custer there too. Benteen said Custer seemed, quote, wonderfully interested in me, and told Benteen that he had met his cousin, Lawrence Cobright, in Washington. Now, Lawrence Cobright was a politically connected and powerful member of the Associated Press and had been for 30 years. He'd been a friend of President Abraham Lincoln and one of the first to report Lincoln's assassination. Benteen, always viewing everything Custer did with suspicion, would later write, I began to scent out the cause of this wing division, but at no time did I seek out any preferment through Cobright's influence. But we have already established that Benteen was actually the third in charge, or third in command. And we'll see that Custer, perhaps because of his disagreement with President Grant, will more than once try to smooth out things with his subordinates in an effort to win their support during this entire campaign. Early in the morning of May 17th, the 750-man 7th Cavalry left Fort Lincoln, accompanied by 3 companies of infantry, a Gatling gun detachment, more than 40 Arikara scouts, 200 wagons, and more than 150 civilian teamsters. The band played "The Girl I Left Behind Me." The countdown begins. The 7th Cavalry is only 5 weeks away from the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And this, my friends, is where we will leave today. I'm so sorry to leave you right there, right at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I will try my hardest to get the final installment out there as soon as possible. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I don't have very many subscribers, so whenever I get a new one, it's like a little gift and makes me feel less like a crazy person. I'm not just creating these things in a vacuum. So thank you. Thank you to all of you who have watched. If you have comments, please put them down below in the dialogue and I will try to respond. Thank you especially to my research partners, Dale Cosman and Annie Donofrio, who have just been so good to me, and I could not do any of these presentations without their help and their friendship. So you guys are the best. Okay, hope to see you guys soon. I will be working on new ones, so stay tuned. Thank you so much, guys. Gary Owen.